BRICS, how does it affect us?
We've always wanted to establish what we call a BRICS Youth Council that could have senior members of each country's government sit on there to do exactly this, is expand the range of opportunities that are available.
Welcome back to Palatable Politics, a show where we take the complexity out of politics, make it palatable for you. With me, your host, TJ Maslela. Welcome to the show. In today's session, we're going to be discussing entrepreneurship with the focus on the youth. Who else, other than to give us insight, is the CEO of the NYDA, Mr Waseem Carrim. Welcome to the show.
Hey, TJ.
Let's go a bit into your background, right? You are the youngest CFO ever in a public enterprise. You have your MBA, you have a master's in taxation. What led you to enter the public space?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's an interesting question, right? So, I mean, it kind of goes back to my family history a little bit, because my family's always been involved in the struggle against apartheid. So, my grandparents were members of the ANC. My grandfather spent some time imprisoned as well during the apartheid era. So I'd say we were always politically aware as a family, although I've been grown up most of my life in a democratic dispensation. I was very young, 6 years old when democracy came to South Africa. There was always political awareness in our family, I think we understood South Africa's struggles and its people's struggle in particular, yeah. And I think beyond that, having gone through school and particularly higher education, one gets involved in student politics, for example, through student representative councils. And I think you start to understand the struggles of people, but in my case, particularly young people, So democracy is almost painted as this event that will solve all of South Africa's issues, yeah. And then you get to university and you realize, many of our problems are still there, yeah. So I think that awareness, of course, many chartered accountants don't work in the public sector, yeah. But I really see the public sector as the vehicle for change in South Africa, yeah. Its ability to impact on people's lives, to impact on young people's lives, to transform the landscape of our country, and an ability for one to make a difference in society and build a legacy. Yeah. So I think that was always the attraction for me. Yeah. Towards the public sector.
Yeah, shout out for dedicating your life to that. Now the NYDA. What's it about? How did it come out? What's it trying to achieve?
So I think the NYDA has been a controversial institution, right? I don't think we should ever shy away from that. Yeah, I don't want us to have a soft conversation. So I think youth development has always been something that's central to South Africa, right? You even hear it in conversations today about how come we have so many old people in parliament, where's the representation of young people, yeah? South Africa has always had a young, vibrant society. We know, for example, the role that young people played in fighting the apartheid regime. You know how important the generation of 1976. But it's not only isolated to the generation of 1976. Right from the 1940s till now, you'll find that young people have led the struggle for a more just society, yeah? And I think there has been a recognition by the state and political parties that young people have a role to play in the state and the development state that is South Africa, yeah? So you had democratic government implement institutions that were meant to advance the youth development agenda. So, for example, even just outside organizations like the NYDA, you had a huge amount of investment in basic education, right? Which we know benefits in the majority young people. It's designed and centered around young people. Yeah, we had the transformation of higher education. So we went from having TEFSA, for example, into NSFAS. Yeah, that was another advancement of the youth development agenda. There was a huge amount of investment in civil society, right? So you might remember we had organizations like Love Life when we were growing up, Soul City, who were there to respond to the health challenges that young people were facing at the time. And investment in civil society comes from the private sector, but it also comes from the public sector. Yeah. And I think the idea was that, outside of formal education, there also needed to be developmental institutions which could support young people's development in the country. And you had two fundamental institutions that were established. The one was the Umsombomfu Youth Fund, which was a development finance, skills development agency that really targeted young people outside the formal education space. Yeah, okay. And then you had the National Youth Commission, which was located in the presidency, which was what we would call a coordinating body. So kind of there to advise the president on, across all these institutions of government, are we really achieving what we want to achieve for youth development?
And whose administration was that?
So those would have been, I think, started towards the end of President Mandela's administration, but really formalized in President Mbeki's administration. Yeah. And I always say that, there's this narrative that politics and political parties in the state should be kept separate from one another. But it's virtually impossible to do that, right? When all of your representatives in parliament are representatives of political parties. So politics will always influence the state, and each party that wants to govern will implement its own policies as is outlined in their manifestos and things like that. So largely the decision to form the NYDA was a political decision, right? It was informed by the election of Julius Malema to become the president of the ANC Youth League in, I think it was around 2007, 2008.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. And one of the outcomes of that ANC Youth League conference was that there should be a unitary structure for youth development, of course, which ultimately became the NYDA, and which was a merger of the National Youth Commission and the Umsombomfu Youth Fund. Yeah. So just an example of how politics becomes part of the state is that you had that decision being taken. The Youth League would have used their professionals and their competence and their skills to say, how do we manifest this inside the state? A bill was drafted within Parliament, which went through the cabinet process and then ultimately to Parliament to merge those two institutions into one, And the National Assembly voted for what became the NYDA Act of 2009. And then His Excellency at the time, President Zuma, proclaimed, I think it was on Youth Day 2009, the establishment of the NYDA. Yeah. So that's how you get to where you are today. And it's interesting now because actually 13 years later, 14 years later, an amendment to the NYDA Act is now on the president's desk, and how policies over time have changed and have informed the new narrative around the NYDA, and what it should be to young people in society. So changes in politics will always result in changes in institutions, And I think it's always important that young people make that distinction. Because I sometimes think the narrative is these two things are separate. And they can never be separate, not only in South Africa, but around the world. Yeah?
But just politics across life as a whole. But now you said that there's an amendment.
Yeah.
How is that going to change the mandate of NYDA? What's it hoping to achieve?
Yeah, so I think some of the challenges around the NYDA were in relation to almost creating it as kind of like a mini government for young people, right? So to say, we understand that young people have challenges in South Africa, and the NYDA will solve all of those challenges, which is largely an impossible mandate, right? So the way the South African state is structured is that there are multiple agencies, there are a number of government departments. So, for example, the NYDA is expected to play a role in coordinating the education sector, but we're not necessarily there to, implement education, for example. We don't take young people to write their matric, for example. We don't enroll them in institutions of higher learning, but we we advise the Minister of Higher Education. For example, there's been a lot of voices around the missing middle, for higher education. So we provide advice and coordination support. Yeah. So I think the initial legislation that was drafted created a lot of inability of the NYDA to fulfill its mandate to society. And I think the idea around the amendment bill is, one, to strengthen governance in the organization, but two, to be able to give it a mandate that it can realistically implement, and to give it a little bit more powers in being able to hold the public sector, the private sector to account to actually achieve what we want to achieve for young people. Yeah.
You mentioned governance now, right? And earlier we spoke about you touched the element of controversy in NYDA.
Yeah.
How tough is it? I mean, okay, there's this narrative that as a professional, being in the public sector is a no-no. You go there to run your career. Yeah. What's your experience been?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I know life mostly in the public sector. I've often been reflecting to say, well, I actually celebrate 10 years at the NYDA at the end of February. Yeah. Time to throw me a huge party.
Congrats.
So, I mean, I've spent a large portion. I've actually forgotten what it's like to be in the private sector. I try and remember sometimes, But I think that narrative does exist. I can't say it's completely true. I think we look at a few isolated cases that may have happened, where people are now criminally charged or they may have been suspended. And I think the unfortunate reality is that, in the digital age, everything lives online. It's important, and even if something is false, it's very difficult to remove it from your profile. Yeah, but I think with that being said, there's a number of people who've built, very positive careers in the public sector. You just take somebody like Maria Ramos, for example, who started out as the Director General of National Treasury, or started out in the National Treasury, became a Director General, was able to move into the private sector, became the CEO of APSA, I think now is the chair of Anglo-American. And I think you'll find those stories littered across the public sector. The former DG of Home Affairs is a senior executive, is one of the financial services companies,
That's Discovery.
Yeah. And I think that kind of relationship between the private sector and the state used to exist. So I think there was this idea. So I almost think what sometimes happens is that when political administrations change, political deployees might change, and that may necessitate change in executive administrations and things like that. And I think there used to be a case where executives could seamlessly move between the public sector and the private sector. I think part of the problem is that relationship seems to have broken down a lot. So it's almost like now that you're in the public sector, that's where you're going to stay forever, and it's very difficult to move. And if you're in the private sector, you're treated with a lot of suspicion in the public sector, and I think it's very important that we correct that narrative. Because I think, again, in democracies around the world, or in governments around the world, that transition should be seamless. We should be able to apply our skills across different sectors. And I think more than anything, it will improve the capacity of the development state if we could do that. Yeah.
Okay. And then the youth element, you touched earlier, the importance of, that the state has recognized the importance of youth participation. But from the other side, there's a narrative or perception that youth don't have that interest, don't have the participation. Would you say it's true? Would you say it's not? And what's the importance of the youth, especially in an election year?
Yeah, so I think what we must avoid is, simplistic arguments and homogeneous arguments more than anything else. So we almost paint entireties of youth with the same brush, right? So let's take participation in elections for one, right? Which is just one piece of participation in democracy. So, young people are apathetic, they're hopeless, so they don't participate in electoral processes, yeah? Whereas South Africa's youth voting trends are not dissimilar to the United States or the United Kingdom, which is relatively mature democracies around the world. Yeah? So
lower turnouts.
They do, yeah. So young people in general vote less than their adult counterparts. And it's informed by a variety of reasons. If you think back to when you were 21 years old, you weren't as interested as you are now, right? Because I think also as you progress through your life, you realize the importance of the state providing services, and you realize the importance of ideologies and things like that, because you use roads more often, or you may have to interact with the Department of Home Affairs, or whatever it might be. So you become
tax,
or just tax, of course, right, which is a big issue, So I think that narrative is not necessarily entirely correct, right? I think we could spend a lot more time around things like voter education, around engagement of young people. I think young people want to be engaged, and I think it's up to many of us to do that engagement and to tell a story sometimes beyond just the general media narrative. If you think about South Africa, largely our opinion is dominated by probably 4 large newspaper groups and maybe 3 large television groups here. So the information flow is very limited in nature. And I think we have to expand that, which is I think what we're also doing here to some extent,
Okay. No, that's solid. But now back to the NYDA.
Yeah.
When you came in as CFO, you became CEO. When you came in as CEO, what was your vision? What were the things you said, this is what I'm going to achieve? Yeah.
So I think the NYDA cannot be separated from the youth unemployment question in South Africa, right? I always say we shouldn't reduce the NYDA to an employment agency because it's so much more than that, right? But you can't run away from the fact that South Africa has the highest youth unemployment rate in the world. And whether you like it or not, you'll always be expected to be responsive to the agenda of the day, right? So I think ours was to put in place the measures that could set South Africa on a more sustainable path for youth employment, right? Because I always like to reflect on the fact that employment is more than just a job. Work gives us purpose. When we wake up in the morning and we have nowhere to go, we start to lose our purpose for life. So work means more than just money. Of course, economic activity is important, but more than anything, it makes people productive. It allows them to fulfill their potential as human beings. So I think for us, that was the number one element that we wanted to address, and kind of beyond the NYDA, build the political support for a comprehensive youth employment agenda in the country. I think that was first and foremost. I think the second thing was, I think there was a lot of negative narrative around the NYDA, and to kind of create the agency more as a voice for young people, that could adequately project the aspirations of young people to the powers that be. And I think
do they listen?
I think they do. Well, look, I can only speak for the former and the current president. But I think, having worked in both administrations, I think they always do take the views of young people seriously. And I think, there's this narrative sometimes that they don't care. But I think it's something, the youth unemployment question in particular, is something that weighs heavily on the leadership of the day. And then I think the last thing was really just to be a collaborative organization, to really recognize that the challenges we face can't be solved in isolation, and that you really need partners to be able to do that, and to really have open doors to any partnership. There was no partnership that was too small that could support the transition of young people, and I think that was really where we saw the organization going over the term of office,
And then I know one of the first initiatives was a presidential program.
The Presidential Youth Employment Intervention.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think, when President Ramaphosa came to office, it was around about 2018. So again, if you remember, if we were talking about it the other day, actually, it was 2017, the ANC conference, and there was the recall of President Zuma. It was quite a tense day. It was Valentine's Day 2018. Is he going to go? Is he going to stay? And President Ramaphosa came to office, and I think there was, for him, there has always been an element of how do we fundamentally address the huge youth unemployment issue that we have in the country. And it's not so much from a case of, this thing is going to a ticking time bomb and it's going to blow up in our face, but more a case of how do we get more young people engaged in South Africa? Because I think we all know the value of that first opportunity. How do we give young people that first opportunity? So I think the president and the presidency's feeling was that it had to be more comprehensive. There was a lot of isolated initiatives that were happening in the civil society, in the private sector, in the public sector, and there needed to be more of a consolidation of resources, right? So just to give you an example, that every time the youth unemployment figures are reported, the NYDA is called to the media and said, you guys are doing nothing, whereas there's an entire Department of Employment and Labor, which is meant to really we play a supportive role to that there.
And a Department for Women.
Yeah, 100%, So the president's view is really, how do we consolidate many of these initiatives so that we're not duplicating efforts, but really we consolidate our efforts and our resources. And that culminated in the announcement, I think it was State of the Nation 2020 of the Youth Employment Intervention, a comprehensive analysis of what we could do for young people across a number of government departments, but also bringing in the private sector. And it had a number of components attached to it. I think the one was that there is a lack of skills in South Africa. So we are transitioning to being a more skilled economy, and young people are not always prepared. But that we had spent money on skills development in the past, so we'd given young people lots of certificates, and you'll hear young people say this, is that we don't want any more certificates, we just want jobs now, How do we train young people for emerging demand in the economy? I'll give you an example, right? South Africa is now the number one destination for global business services, for call centers, data processing centers, and it's not necessarily challenging to train young people for a job there. And those are jobs that pay relatively well for first-time work seekers, to the point where companies, international companies, are building infrastructure in the townships because they're saying that many of our people that we're employing come from these areas. And to make the commute to work much easier for them, it doesn't make sense for us to have an office in the city center or in the metro, So that's creating a catalyzing knock-on effect of investment as well.
And it's also changing the spatial planning.
100%. Yeah. So that was one element. Of course, two is the support to entrepreneurs. And I remember in that State of the Nation, we announced an exciting campaign to fund 1,000 youth-owned enterprises in 100 days. And then one of the other components, and something I'm quite passionate about, was the National Youth Service. And South Africa has always spoken about youth service, but we've never really had a very large youth service program. So those are the components attached to the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention. Of course, not even 4 weeks after that, so now we were in a national lockdown because of the pandemic. Talk about, your plans being derailed by the universe. So things needed to be adjusted, new things came about like the 350 Rand grant and whatever. But having emerged from the pandemic, we feel that we've made some degree of progress. We're not where we want to be, but if we look at post-pandemic, we've had 8 consecutive quarters of reductions in youth unemployment, right? And people will say, okay, but it's marginal, it's 1% every quarter, But those 1% add up, right? So if we take that and we project that into 2030, we say we could have a youth unemployment rate that's sub 20%. And suddenly things start to look much better in the country, So we do believe that what we're doing is planting trees that young people in the future will sit in the shade of, building structural and institutional change for the future.
Systematically changing, structurally changing. So let's say we have a Thuli there. They would like support for their business. What are the programs? I know you touched on the National Youth Service Program. Can you run us through the other programs and how our homies get involved?
Of course. So I think, when we talk about entrepreneurship, it's always important to to quantify why, right?
Okay.
If you look at the structure of South Africa's economy, so I'll give you an interesting statistic, right? If you take the whole world, you'll find that about 45% of people are formally employed. They have a day job that they go to and they get a salary. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. And then you have about 45% of people who run their own small businesses, work in the informal economy, participate in the gig economy. And relatively
gig economy.
Yeah, gig economy. Whether they're Uber drivers or they work as an artisan on Kandua or whatever else it might be. And we find that about 10% of people are unemployed. This is global figures, right? And if you look at that stat in South Africa, we find that about 50 to 60% of people are formally employed. About 10% run their own small businesses, gig economy, informal economy, and about 30 to 40% are unemployed. So you can tell our issue is not really on the formal employment side. There's quite enough people who have 9-to-5 jobs. It's really, we haven't activated that micro small enterprise sector. And I think we know, just if we look around, we travel around, we know that proportionally, and it's controversial, immigrants have taken more advantage of the opportunities that exist there. Now, that's not necessarily young people's fault. There's issues on both the supply and demand side. You touched on spatial planning, for example. So if you go into communities around the world, you'll find that the penetration of large corporates into deep rural communal areas in South Africa is unlike anything we've ever seen, which makes it, and I mean, I think the Competition Commission once did an inquiry about, when a ShopRite opens, yes, it might create a lot of jobs, but it also forces a lot of small businesses to shut down. So the idea is that people who are aspirational and want to start their own small businesses, their micro enterprises, they need support from the state to be able to do so. The question for us often is, if you think about a young person who's, coming out of school, may or may not have completed matric, often comes from a vulnerable or marginalized household, where do you start, right? Here's the
social
the president or the minister of small business says, we need more entrepreneurs in the country, but how? What's the practical step? So I've overcome that emotion of I don't want to be dependent. I want to start my own thing. Where do you start? And I think what we've tried to shape the NYDA as is a place for young people to go when they want to start, right? So the first thing we start young people off with is our business management training. So it's what we call an entrepreneurial boot camp. If you've never heard of entrepreneurship, that'll teach you where to start. Basics of selling, the basics of marketing your business, the different platforms that exist. How would you set up an e-commerce site if you wanted to? What are the different institutions that may be able to help you to where you get to? So we often see that as the right place to start. We give young people the opportunity to pitch their ideas in a safe, comfortable environment. So getting young people started.
In terms of creating a conducive environment.
Of course, Yeah. And then I think from there, we offer development finance through grants. The reason why we use grants is to say, you don't want to burden a young person who's just coming out of, school or wherever else with the loan. And what we found is that often those loans, if they're unable to pay them back, it creates bad credit records for them and elements like that, which then impacts them for their whole lives. We've just found a much more sustainable return on investment by doing micro enterprise grants. So if you want 5 million from the NYDA, we can't help you. Okay. But if you would just want to get started up to 250,000, that's where we come in, right? So our view to young people is often, there was a young person that came to me and we had a discussion, and he was like, I want to start a gym and I need 3 million, and I'm not gonna move off this hill of I'm gonna sit at home until I get my 3 million. And we used to talk often, and I said, I don't think it's possible because of a number of factors. And if I was you, I was quite a fit young person. He used to have his routine and things. He was passionate about what he wanted to do. And I said, if you want to start a gym, why don't we start you off being a personal trainer? Yeah, we'll hook you up. You get started. You're working for yourself, right? Because yes, you're working under a banner, but you're really working in the gig economy. Yeah. And from there, let's support you to transition through NYDA grant into starting your own kind of gym. Yeah. And I think that's the idea. If you want to be a chicken farmer, let's get you started by selling eggs. Yeah.
And just build.
Yeah. So I think that's the idea that we see for ourselves. It's also controversial because people believe that sometimes the rhetoric is that young people must be owners of the economy. They must own the means of production. But how? I always ask the question, how do we get there? Yeah. And we think this is a good place to start. Of course, we don't want to leave young people on their own. So what we do is even after we give them a grant, we offer them 2 years of mentorship and aftercare and support because there's a lot of opportunities. So a lot of private companies, for example, have obligations that they need to fulfill in terms of their enterprise supply development, in terms of their broad-based Black economic empowerment. So then our role becomes different, is that how do we help you market yourself so you can access markets? Yeah? Because that's another piece of the puzzle that's lacking. So we see this puzzle being threefold. First, we start off with the skills to run a business. Then it's the access to finance. Then it's the access to markets. Yeah? And if we can get those three things working together, we'll cultivate a new generation of entrepreneurs that can one day own the means to production and South Africa.
And have the gym.
Yeah.
And then I know there's also the mentorship. I assume the last one you talked on was the market linkage.
Yeah.
The mentorship speaks to the guiding and walking that 2 years.
Yeah. So of course, because we are in a grant process, there's no payback. So what we ask our grant beneficiaries to do, the ones who have succeeded in business, is to become a mentor to other young people. Yeah. Because we find mentorship both in the corporate environment, but also in the business environment, plays a huge role. Somebody to be able to talk to, somebody who understands the frustrations that you face, that plays a massive role in success or failure.
Okay, so now the BRICS component.
Yeah.
I know you guys had a summit last year. Yeah. BRICS, how does it affect us, youth, entrepreneurs? What are the tangible things that came out of that, other than the statements?
Of course. So I think it's such an important question, right? And it's pertinent now because we see so many global moves happening, but it's happening in a negative scenario because there's a couple of major conflicts or wars that are ongoing, right? So I think, of course, if we go back to post-World War II, there was a dominance of the Allied forces and the Western powers, and that ultimately led to the formation of what we call the Bretton Woods institutions, so the World Bank, the IMF, yeah. And of course, the United States has always been seen as the superpower, the leader of the world, and the strong emergence of China in the last 30 or 40 years has challenged that hegemony for the first time, that the United States enjoyed. And I think South Africa, of course, having been supported by governments such as Cuba, such as Russia, during the apartheid years, has an affiliation for global South movement, for an alternative world order. And I think that largely informed the formation of BRICS. So South Africa has always punched above its weight internationally. Post-democracy, we've been invited to be part of the G20. And it's largely because of our position in the world. We're still seen as Africa's most industrialized economy. So
even though we're not the biggest.
Even though we're not the biggest, yeah. Okay. We have a few things that pull in our favor. So that invitation to BRICS was probably penciled in on, we are the prominent industrialized society on the African continent. Yeah. But it has a couple of meanings for what happens into the future, right? So I think some of what you see in international relations is smoke and mirrors sometimes, but there's a lot that we can draw out of it, right? So if I had to bring it down to a young person's level, is to say, as South Africa, we enjoy all of these international relationships. We are Mandela's children, So how do we make these benefit for South African young people? And if you think about what a South African young person wants on a day-to-day basis, they want the opportunity to be able to study, for example. So, one of the things we've said to our BRICS partners is, if you've got international scholarship opportunities, within this, one, how do we introduce young people to them? But two, how do we help young people or how do we increase the number of opportunities that are available? Because we know our young people want to go. They want to explore the world. They want to learn more about society. So how do we increase that? We have thriving young people who are doing entrepreneurship in South Africa, who want to expand beyond our borders. They want to trade in China. If you read the story about Nike, they always saw China as the market that they needed to get into. They had a motto that said 1 billion people, 2 billion feet, So in South Africa, you're trading with a population of 60 million people. Think about the opportunities that exist. Yeah, that exist if you go beyond. But how do I get into those markets? What are the challenges? How can we, at the level we operate at, help to break down those challenges so more South African businesses are operating in East Asia, in Russia, anywhere else in the world? Yeah. And then a little bit more of a controversial one is employment, right? So if we're having challenges around employment in South Africa, but in our BRICS partners, there's labor shortages, we should have a flexible labor movement, right? In a legal way, where if young people want to work and the opportunity exists for them to work and utilize their skills, we should be using these relationships to exploit them.
So, for example, with this teaching the English.
Yeah. And even so, many of these countries, they have aging populations, Yeah. They will need nurses and caregivers into the future that lots of South African young people can earn currency in foreign markets and be able to exploit opportunities, And our idea was, okay, how do we maximize these opportunities? And then to be able to do that, you need some level of structure. So we've always wanted to establish what we call a BRICS Youth Council, right? That could have senior members of each country's government sit on there to do exactly this, is expand the range of opportunities that are available. Because it's all well and good to sit and have these summits and talk, but what does it mean for a young person?
Yeah, what does it translate to?
What does it translate to? Yeah, you've got to make it meaningful. Otherwise, it's just talk and talk and talk. Yeah? And I think that achieving that BRICS Youth Council as South Africa was really something we're proud of, because international relations is tricky. So if you look at this year, there was a lot of tension between India and China, right, for their own bilateral reasons. Yeah. Okay. So when you're the chair, you've almost got to navigate that tension, achieve a goal, and you're doing this across languages and across cultures and things like that. So I think it was a good learning experience. But for us, it's really about how do we take that and translate it into real opportunities for multitudes of young people in South Africa. Yeah.
And what would the answer to that be? So there's a Steve that now wants to maximize or take advantage of these opportunities that have been created by BRICS. What's the next step? Okay, I have this idea. I want to export salt or whatever it is.
Yeah.
What's the next step?
So that young person must be able to walk into an NYDA office, say, this is our stated goal, right? And we support that young person through our relationships at Trade and Industry, through the Youth Council, to our counterparts at their trade and industry.
So you become their champion.
We become their champion, basically. We become a go-to person. When Russia opens up its international scholarships, we actively market that to every young person. We make sure there's full uptake from South African youth. But not only that, when they get there, the embassy is ready to support them. If they have any challenges with the language, they're able to be supported. So we increase the scope and the quality of opportunities, because really that's my feeling of what it comes down to. This generation of young people, they really just want access to opportunities. Yeah.
No, true. Okay. So we know they can find you online, they can walk into the offices.
Yeah.
But one of the big issues that's generally faced in public spaces, the turnaround time.
Yeah.
How do you guys do at that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to lie to you. We seem to be working in a challenging environment. So South Africa, since last year, there's been this talk of a physical crisis and things like that, and the budget that the Minister of Finance passes sometimes gets cut in the year, So you've got to somehow find a way to absorb this cut. So grants that you were about to pay may need to be deferred for a quarter or things like that. So I don't want to lie about the challenging environment that we find ourselves in. So that does impact on turnaround times. With that being said, I think we've really focused on improving our turnaround time. So from the time a young person is approved for a grant, making sure they're paid within 30 days, On our National Youth Service, we run one of the largest national youth service programs in the world. We have 20,000 young people working on that program. And I can almost reassure you that stipend payments don't get paid late to those young people, So I think there's really that element of focus on quality, but even with that, we've got a fully fledged customer contact center where young people can reach out to. We have this vision of being accessible to young people online, in person, and over the phone. So young people can interact with us on our online portal. We have a WhatsApp chatbot that you can interact with. And if all else fails, I'll definitely leave you with my email address and my phone number. You're welcome to post it. Young people, if they're not getting help at any of those levels, can always call me or reach out to me directly.
For your guys' benefits, we'll put it there. But okay, you spoke about the time from approval to disbursement. What about the approval process itself, from application to approval?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to put a hard and fast rule on that one there, because I think it has a number of elements attached to it, right? So the compliance. You may need to get your but if everything goes well, that should not exceed a 60-day process, between you and the grant officer. Sometimes it'll take longer for you to get something signed off or whatever else. But when I speak to my staff members, I always encourage them to say, if somebody needs a Department of Health compliance certificate for establishing a restaurant, we shouldn't leave them to be able to do that on their own. Let's hook up our contacts at the Department of Health and assist them if that process is going slow. If a young person has a lost ID document, let's reach out to our contacts at the Department of Home Affairs. So I see NYDA centers being more than just entrepreneurship or jobs. I see them being hubs to help any young person, a place for young people to go to solve whatever challenge they may be faced on a day-to-day basis.
That's solid. But now, with that said, what would you say have been the biggest challenges and successes of your reign?
Yeah, of course. So I think the one thing I look back on is to say, I think we put in place the measures and the structural reforms to be able to solve youth unemployment in the longer term. But right now, it doesn't fill me with a great amount of happiness that we have, 7 million unemployed young people in the country. It's a very concerning element on my part, and I think I think the state could have done more. I, for example, advocate for something like an employment guarantee for all the young people, that I think could have been implemented by now. Given so the political will, sometimes it goes, but it doesn't go as far as it should. I think, I think we could have done more in that aspect there. I think. We've made a lot of gains in higher education in South Africa. So today, South Africa produces 4 times the amount of black graduates than we did in 1994. But there are still too many challenges around higher education. I don't think we've comprehensively dealt with the question around the missing middle. I don't think we've dealt with the issue around historical debt, for example.
It's a big issue.
And I think, unfortunately, in a democratic society, if you have the talent and the ability to acquire post-matric qualification, financial constraints shouldn't hold you back. And I think it's one area where I am concerned that we've failed young people. I think the pandemic was a huge impact. I don't think people realized what a massive impact it had on society. We lost 2 million jobs in the pandemic, Only recently have those jobs come back. But also, I think the toll it took on people from a physical health, from a mental health perspective, it definitely, I think South Africa probably navigated it fairly well. And I mean, my kind of parting shot is around, I think there's this fundamental question that's starting to arise, and I see it in a lot of debates that we have, is around social protection versus work. Yeah. The 350 grant has changed things a lot from a financial perspective, but also from an ideology perspective. And I always advance this argument is to say, do we want to build a society of young people who stand in the queue at the post office every month to collect a social grant? Or do we want a society of young people who work, who feel like they are active citizens in the democracy, who feel that they have value and purpose to add to society? And I think it's an important question that this generation needs to answer and needs to really advocate for. Yeah.
With that said, in an election year, what would your final parting shot be that what youth need to consider?
Yeah, I think what's important is engagement around political education, right? Okay. So for me, I think if I was a young person, right, and I think sometimes we also need to encourage young people to read more, to listen more, to engage more with the different debates. I mean, I'm sure you saw that podcast that went viral where a group of young people are discussing, and they're like, no, but if the DA wins the election, or if the EFF is a coalition with the ANC, then the Western Cape will become an independent state and things like. I think we need to correct those narratives, right? Whether we do it in the classroom or whether we do it at home,
or on a podcast,
and
you subscribe and you like.
Yeah. Because I think look at the damage that fake news has done to democracies like the United States, for example. So I think it is important that we encourage political education, but also for young people to form opinions for themselves around what kind of society do they want. Do they understand what's in political party manifestos? I think this is a tricky election year because of the changes, right? So the Constitutional Court now says to run as an independent, you need 1,000 signatures, which is not a very high threshold, But it also means that in some provinces, you may not have a ballot paper, you may have more of a ballot book, So I think many storytellers in the media and yourselves have a role to play in what's the difference between a political party, what's an independent candidate, and how can you as a young person engage with political processes? Yeah, of course we want participation in electoral processes, but that's not the beginning and the end of it. Yeah, more than anything, we want young people to be engaged and to be voices in the kind of society that they want to build. Yeah. What do they want work and entrepreneurship to look like for them? Yeah? And which political party or independent candidate best speaks to their aspirations that they want to achieve? Yeah? So I think for me, those things are critically important in an election. Yeah. Of course, we know this is a litmus test on South Africa's democracy, right? It really is. And I think more than anything, I'm interested to see the outcomes. I'm interested to see how young people participate. But we must create the ecosystem for that participation. Yeah.
Okay, solid. Thank you for coming through, making time, giving us insight, educating us, and we will reach out again when there are more developments. But thanks a lot.
Thanks, TJ. It's been a pleasure. Yeah.
Guys, thank you for tuning in. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and don't forget to register to vote. See you again next week.